Hello everybody, I'm Devika. I'm a program associate at Science Gallery. So today we have Carol Upadhya. Carol Upadhya is a social anthropologist. She has researched and published widely on a range of social transformations related to development, economic change, urbanization, capital and labor, and migration in contemporary India. She is a visiting professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bengaluru, where she leads the Urban and Mobility Studies program. Professor Upadhya's latest publication is a co-edited volume, Chronicles of a Global City, Speculative Lives and Unsettled Futures in Bengaluru. Thank you so much, Carol, for coming here. Over to you.
So thanks for coming on a Saturday afternoon. The topic of my talk probably looks a bit out of sync with the theme of this exhibition, which is on Bangalore's history as a science and technology city. But I think it's appropriate for us also, when thinking about all the achievements of Bangalore and people in Bangalore, institutions in Bangalore, to think about how the city is made and has been made and is being made. She said, I am a social anthropologist, sociologist. I've been doing work on Bangalore for quite some time. And what I'm talking about today, or going to be presenting today, is some findings from a recently completed research project that we did, that myself and a research partner, Adra Surendran, did on the construction labor in Bangalore. I will, in a minute, get into why I think that's important. Of course, there's many things one could look at when we think about urbanization and we think about the growth of the city. But the people who, provide the labor that actually puts up all these nice buildings are often forgotten in a lot of the ways in which Bangalore is written about in the popular media and so on. So the impetus for our project or study was, as many of you would recall, the migrant labor crisis that happened during the first COVID lockdown in March 2020, when the government suddenly issued an order saying, everything has to stop moving from midnight to night. And that left many, many workers stranded, migrant workers stranded in cities like Bangalore, all those cities across the country really, with really no means of support, no one to kind of manage look after them. And workers decided they wanted to get back to their homes as quickly as possible. But of course, many of the workers in Bangalore are from places very far away, in North India, Eastern India, Bihar, Jharkhand, UP, etc. So we had this spectacle of migrant workers trying to get back home, either on foot or by whatever means of transport they could get. And that, it really became actually an international media spectacle, which I think finally jogged the government to start thinking about the question of migrant labor in India, which has been really neglected for a very long time in terms of policy for social protection and welfare of migrant workers. What I'm going to do so the study that we launched, basically our idea was to understand how the labor supply system works, because most people would be aware that workers generally come through contractors, through labor contractors. So there are contracting chains that supply labor to construction sites, to construction companies, who work for shorter or longer periods of time, depending on the work. So there have been studies looking at labor contracting, of course, in India and elsewhere. But what we felt was missing was an understanding of how the entire chain of labor sourcing and labor management really works in this sector. So we designed this study to try to understand how labor contracting works, right from the level of the worker, coming from a village to the construction site that is being run by one of the large companies in Bangalore. And we also wanted to look at the various welfare policies and schemes that were launched post-COVID to try to address the issues that were identified as far as migrant labor goes. So we carried out this study over about 3 years. We did lots of interviews and also observations at construction sites in Bangalore. And we also followed workers and labor contractors back to their home villages, mostly focusing on 2 districts, one in Bihar and one in Jharkhand. And so basically what I'm going to talk about are some of what I think are the key findings of this study in terms of understanding, first of all, how does this labor supply system work? And secondly, what does that then tell us about the way we should think about policy and the legal framework for migrant workers? So a little bit of background first is, I mean, everyone here is too young to really have to see the difference, but you know, what you see in Bangalore today is not what it was 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. The way the city has boomed is not just a matter of it becoming spatially larger, as you've seen in some of the exhibits, and spreading out into the rural areas around. But it's not just about the traffic jams and all those other issues we always talk about, but there's been a real shift in terms of the nature of construction in the city itself to very large-scale projects, either high-rise apartment buildings or the large tech parks that we see, and as well as various infrastructure projects such as the BMRCL, the Bangalore Metro Rail project, where you see the construction sites all over the city, right? And so up until, you could say, the early 90s, the construction projects at that scale really did not exist. Most of the projects would be like small apartment buildings or individual houses, etc. So what has really happened is with the change in the nature of construction and real estate industry itself, the nature of demand for labor also shifted. And now you have, suddenly you have these large projects which needs hundreds and even thousands of workers on site at one time. So sourcing labor then, of course, then becomes a major issue. And what we have seen through our interviews is that it's not just a matter of scale and increasing the recruitment of workers. The source, the ways in which, or the places from which workers come has completely changed. So up until the 90s, most construction labor in Bangalore came from neighboring states, say Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, or northern Karnataka, where they still come from. And now you see vast majority of workers come from what is generically called North India, which includes the places I just mentioned. So UP, but also Eastern India, Bihar, Orissa, Assam, etc. So there's been a complete shift in the pathway, in the distance from which migrants are coming, and also the pathways through which they come, the modalities through which they land up on construction sites. So what we did in our study was we focused on this long-distance migration circuit rather than the more short-distance ones that we still find. So if you would notice construction sites anywhere that you might be moving around the city, if it's an individual house or a bungalow, you will find families living there, husband, wife, and small kids running around. And those people are normally from northern Karnataka. And they come as families because women are also providing labor. But in this long distance circuit that I'm talking about, men migrate as single males in groups in what they call gangs, leaving their families behind in the village. And this is important for a number of reasons in terms of understanding control over labor and employment conditions. So an important point, of course, and anywhere that you're talking about informal labor in India, which could be any sector, not just construction, employment conditions are marked by precarity. By informality, we simply mean that, by and large, the employment conditions fall outside the ambit of any kind of regulation or existing labor laws really don't apply. But it also refers to the fact that the recruitment and the management of labor is through informal relationships rather than the kind of formal contracts you see if you get a job in an IT company or whatever. We have seen a long history of very poor implementation of labor laws, especially for migrant workers, and there are reasons why that is so. It's obviously very difficult to implement laws for workers who were constantly moving around. And I'll go into that a little bit. But one of the things that we really wanted to look at in our work and understand better is this intersection between a high level of informality when it comes to labor practices and the increasingly organized nature of construction and real estate industries. So one of the things that we've seen also since the 90s is really the growth of very large real estate companies and much larger construction companies, to the point where now we have about 4 or 5 or maybe 8 companies in India that get all the projects when it's a large project. So you can think of your L&T, your HCL, your Shapurji. There's just a few companies you'll see when you travel around and look at, say, have a look at the metro sites. There'll be just a few signboards, just a few companies that actually are getting all the contracts for this work. So we've had an enormous growth in the construction sector and therefore consolidation, a higher level of organization, or what you call corporatization. That is true also in the real estate industry. So the big real estate companies we see in Bangalore, your Prestige, your Shobha, name a few, Embassy, yeah, so this Puravankara, etc. Now there's just a few of these who are putting up the large housing projects and the big tech parks. Whereas earlier there were many, many different companies, and for various reasons, again, there's been a consolidation of the market. So we have now a few big players and maybe a lot of smaller builders, but in between there's been a kind of a shakeout. So we have this consolidation. And what happens when you have a kind of corporatization in these industries, it means that there's also a high level of compliance in terms of the legal requirements and of the government vis-a-vis business, vis-a-vis companies. And yet at the other end, and the most important part of what they do is actually, being able to source labor in order to do their work, that whole end of the business is completely unregulated. So we were interested in unpacking this, understanding a little better, how is it possible that you could have these two things happening at the same time? It seems like a contradiction in terms almost. And our other main point really was to look at the question of policy and the legal framework, because if you can map out the complexity of this industry, then you might be able to think of more suitable, more workable policies and schemes for migrant workers than what we have at the moment. So I'm going to briefly say something about how the labor supply chain works in the construction industry based on our research. So I already spoke about the changing patterns and how workers are increasingly coming from farther and farther away. And by spatial segmentation, I mean this division between the long-distance single male migrant workers who come to the big sites and the family kind of modality of migration to smaller sites. But one thing that we found quite interesting is that when we formulated our research questions, we imagined that there would be something like a contracting chain. So there would be like a village level contractor who are normally in the business called Tekidar. There would be a Tekidar who could, pick up 10 or 20 workers, and he would be connected with some middleman, maybe in the district town or the state capital, who, would consolidate workers from a few people like him, and then it would go up the chain to the construction site. But that's not what we found. We found really a high level of fluidity in the way in which the contracting system works, and a high level of variability. So we couldn't trace discrete pathways or chains, say from a particular site or company in Bangalore to a particular area in Jharkhand. Things were shifting all the time. Companies were recruiting workers from wherever they could in terms of the contractors that they were in touch with. And even the recruitment strategies that were used by Tekidars, we found a lot of variability. So one thing about recruitment is that in the literature, there is a lot of discussion about debt bondage, and this notion that when you have an informal contracting relationship, that that basically the takedar will loan money to the worker, which then they have to work to pay off. So it's a kind of a debt bondage. And this is very much true in some industries, but in the case of these large construction projects in Bangalore, what we found is that, yes, advance payments are made, but it doesn't really put the worker at the beck and call of the takedar, because the workers may also run away, right? So there's an obligation that works in both ways, a kind of debt obligation that works in both directions. So what we found is that compared to what a lot of studies have talked about, the patronage relationship, that has become much more instrumental. So for example, in the literature you'll find, and again, if you're looking at the North Karnataka migration stream, it may be true, you may find that, the same workers that a takedar or a contractor has as kind of the same set of workers that he has over a number of years, and he deputes them to different sites. So there's a long-standing relationship, which could be based on the, residing in the same village, or it could be based on kinship or whatever. But here we found very few workers who stick with the same takedar. Every time, we tried to collect work histories. So what did you do before this job? I went to Delhi with so-and-so on this and this site. Before that, I was in Bombay with a different guy, on a different kind of a project. They all have these highly varied work histories, which means that, in a sense, the worker becomes a resource that takedars need to try to nurture in order to build up the gang that they need in order to fulfill the contract that they have. And so in the narratives, in the interviews we did with workers and with the takedars, the narrative of trust was very important, and reputation. It's like, why would you go with this guy? How can you be sure he's going to pay you at the end? It's a matter of, I have to trust him. It's because someone else has recommended him, or again, because he's given me advance of 15,000 rupees, etc. And so takedars have to work to build a reputation in the villages in order to attract workers to supply to these sites. Another really important or interesting finding for us was the relationship that is cultivated between the construction companies, or I should say, individual managers. So it could be a deputy general manager, could be a project manager, could be site manager. These are the different layers within a construction company. Those individuals cultivate relationships with individual takedars who they will call upon as and when they need labor for a project. So this is not like your typical government system, right, where the government or even a company floats a tender and different contractors come and bid, and then whoever gives the best bid or the lowest bid gets the project, gets the contract. There is sometimes an actual bid, but that's not how the contracts are rewarded. Here is where we find a kind of patronage relation between, say, a general manager who was, managing many engineers within one company. I'm just using as example, say, L&T. And he has with him 20 or 30 takedars who he knows because of his long history in this business, who he can call upon, who he can rely upon to bring workers. So there's a give and take here also. So this is where you begin to see the intersection between formality and informality. There's a formal system in which the company calls for a work order, say they need 100 workers on some site, so they need to issue a work order for that. But the way it gets issued or it gets decided is because of interpersonal relations between takedars and these managers. So that is just one example of this, what I talk about as the entanglement of the formal and the informal in control over labor and the labor supply system. So this is a very bad attempt at making a diagram. I tried to take all what we had learned and stick it into a diagram to understand the organization of labor contracting, which only these little boxes only show a few of the different actors who would be there. But basically, you can already see how complicated it is. And also the main point is that the division between what I'm calling organized sector, so the big companies, the construction companies, et cetera, and the unorganized sector, it's a continuum. It's not just a dichotomy, right? And what I need to do is develop this to show better where things are more or less organized, more or less informal, at which stage, and in which kind of relationship. Okay. One more thing before I move on to the question of law and policy is that I also became very interested in looking at how the construction labor process works on construction sites. So somehow from what my reading, I had imagined that the job of the takedar is to bring workers and dump them, right? And then they have to do work, whatever is assigned to them on the project. But we discovered that that's not at all the case. In fact, the takedar himself is responsible for ensuring that the work gets done. And takedars employ one or more what they call supervisors who live on site with the workers and who make sure things happen. So here, the relationship between his supervisor, the takedar supervisor, and the site engineers is very crucial, because the site engineer and the site manager are the guys who have the plans, right? So there's a plan about what has to happen, and then there's a work plan as to what has to go up when, and construction, of course, is a complicated process, which I can't get into here. But to actually get the work executed by the workers, the site manager or engineer has to tell the takedar's supervisor that, on this day we have to lay 100 meters of bar, or we have to pour, X number of cubic feet of cement. And then the supervisor, who is the one who's directly in touch with the worker, who knows them very well, and who also has to develop relations of trust with the workers, is the one who actually supervises and gets the work done on site. And then, of course, when there are problems, there are then arguments between the supervisor and the site engineer and his manager and the takedar, and there are constant negotiations around the workflow and around the work schedule. Like, okay, you want me to lay this much of rebar today, but I don't have enough men. Or you want me to, pour this much cement, but the truck is off schedule, So these complications are really ripe for much more kind of ethnographic fieldwork to understand how this works. But the main point here really is that by the management of the actual work of construction lies, and the responsibility for that lies with the takedar, not with the company that is actually doing the project. That very much allows the company, the construction company and its management to distance itself from the labor process, right? So once it's given the contract, it has an overall plan, right? So I need so many takedars who bring bar benders, I need so many who bring carpenters. It has an overall work plan, but what's happening on the site, the question of labor, the conditions of labor, what workers are paid, how are they paid, how are they treated, all of these things are completely not of interest to the company that has given the contract. Now, this may seem really obvious if you think about the fact that it is a contracting system, but somehow, to me, it was a surprise simply because, as I said, with the consolidation and growth of real estate industry and construction companies in Bangalore, there's a huge stress on quality. And you cannot do quality control unless you have a lot of centralization in kind of managing processes, making sure materials are, installed correctly, and so on and so forth. So here you have this huge gap between what is on paper in terms of what's supposed to be done, and we've seen on field really how these supervisors actually manage that work process through a kind of more jugaad kind of a system, right? Just getting things done, but not necessarily according to the way it's been laid out by the managers. Okay, so that is a kind of background about how the labor process works, how it's controlled. And I want to now move to the question of policies and welfare schemes against that background. Let's see if I missed anything. So one thing, the last point here is simply that the way we are conceiving of what we're writing about this whole issue is we're talking about it in terms of labor governance. The question is, how is labor governed in this sector? And when I say governance, we refer first to the informal contracting relationships that I spoke about. Second, we have the construction companies and the real estate companies who are the principal employer in terms of the contract labor law. And third, I want to bring in the state, because the state does intervene in these processes in particular ways through the laws which exist, through various schemes that exist, et cetera. And so what we need to look at is how all these three elements intersect in terms of producing a certain kind of situation for migrant workers. So, what is the policy and legal framework for migrant workers? It is very complicated. I don't want to bore you by getting into too much of detail. There is a policy framework, and here I'm talking about what's called interstate migrants, so migrants going between one state and another. If we're talking about interstate, there's a different list over here. And there is a series of labor laws or acts which apply to these kind of workers, and they've been on the books for a long time. The problem, of course, is how to actually make them work. That's always been the problem with many of these laws. But the first important point is that we do see an overall shift in policy focus since the 1990s from this notion of labor rights. And this you can see if you compare the reports of the first and the second National Commissions on Labor. The first was published in 1969 and the second in 2002. And in the second report, they basically say that it is impossible to implement existing labor laws for informal sector workers and for migrant workers. And so we are going to shift to a regime of welfare provision. That is, we will try to ensure that workers get a certain amount of protection, security, economic security, et cetera. But going at that through a legal regime is not the way to do it. So the report suggested the creation of various social security and other welfare provisions for unorganized workers as an alternative to bringing them under the umbrella of organized sector labor regulation. And this approach we see, if we look at the post-COVID situation, has only been strengthened. In other words, the government has no intention or interest in implementing labor rights or laws in this sector. But there are some legacy laws, and I've listed them here: Interstate Migrant Workmen Act, Contract Labor Act. The BOCW is the most important. There are two acts under the BOCW. Some of you would have heard of this. And BOCW is important because every state has set up what's called the Building and Other Construction Workers Welfare Board, with which workers in this category are supposed to register if they're on the job for more than a certain period, I think 6 months. They're supposed to register, and registering with the BOCW board allows them or provides certain benefits. So for example, pension or insurance in case of accident or death, et cetera. But there have been all kinds of issues with the implementation of the BOCW laws as well. Overall, a history of poor implementation across states. Some states have done better than others, but generally we see this is the situation. And one of the biggest problems has been what's called non-portability of benefits. So I'm a worker from Jharkhand. I've come to Bangalore. Even if I've worked here for a year and I go register with the BOCW board, which is supposed to give me certain benefits, once I migrate back to my home state, I have no way to access those. So this is called the portability problem, which recent legislation has tried to fix. That why can't we make welfare benefits or other kinds of benefits portable across the entire country? So the new labor codes that were introduced in a big hurry, some of you would recall in 2020, the central government introduced with the idea of rationalizing this system. So we have a number of different laws that deal with labor. They say we have to, and they've been put in place at different points of time. We need to rationalize this. We need to come out with new labor codes that will bring all of this together in a much more organized and workable way. Those labor codes have been passed. There are 3 of them, but not all states. What happens is because labor is on the concurrent list in the Constitution, So central government can pass laws and can make frameworks for labor regulation, but the state governments have to pass their own laws, right? So in all the states, this has not yet been notified. That includes Karnataka. So that's another issue, is that just getting these new labor laws through, and there was also a lot of backlash by labor unions and other activists about some of the provisions. But for what we were looking at here, what was most interesting about the new laws and about the new programs that were brought in after COVID was the stress on digitalization. And this is something that we've seen across the board in welfare provision, in governance, in all kinds of sectors. In India, of course, we know this huge push to use digital technologies to streamline government, to reduce leakage, et cetera, et cetera. But there are certain issues with that, which I will talk about. So what were the policy responses post-COVID, post the lockdown migrant labor crisis? The first is the central government quickly came out with a thing called the Mission Mode Project. And the Mission Mode Project was basically telling all the state governments that they need to get more workers registered under the BOCW board. Number one, and number two, they need to do that by digitalizing the registration process, which until this point was not. So earlier it was like you have to go to the board and fill up a form and hand it to the labor officer and get it stamped and whatever. So the main response, really, if you look at the Mission Mode Project, was really to focus on the registration of migrant workers. And the reason was because in the COVID crisis, the government suddenly realized that we have no way to track these workers. We don't know where they're from, we don't know where they're working, we don't know who's responsible for them. So first we need a database. And how do we do that? So they started with the Mission Mode Project to bring all construction workers under the cover of the BOCW welfare boards. So the Mission Mode Project aimed to do away with the difficulties that had been faced earlier in registering workers, but they switched to fully online processes by which the worker has to do, it's a self-certification process, which is, the worker is responsible, for which they have to furnish details of their bank accounts, Aadhaar number, a working cell phone number linked to their Aadhaar number, et cetera, et cetera. As you all know, you've all done this kind of online stuff for the government. But 4 years or 5 years down the line, we have no data in the public realm about what was the effect of this Mission Mode Project. We could not get any data also from BOCW board in Bangalore. Basically, I think it was a washout. It didn't really operate the way they had imagined. So fine. So then the next big thing that the government came up with was the eShram portal, which I'm going to come back to in a minute. But at the same time, different state governments, especially the states that send a lot of migrants out, for example, Jharkhand, were coming up with their own systems for registering and tracking workers, interstate migrant workers. So overall, what we see is a policy thrust on registration and enumeration of workers as a precursor or a base for enhancing Social Security and welfare cover. So nothing wrong in that in itself. It's just that what I'm going to talk about are all the issues that they ran into in trying to implement these systems. And the most important thing to me that happened was that we now had a proliferation of different welfare policies and schemes at the central level, at the state level, and creating a kind of confusing scenario where no one's really sure what they're supposed to register, how, where, and what's the point of it all. And the other thing that really happened is this policy response that we saw really amounted to what we saw even with the earlier labor codes, is that this idea of centralizing databases and centralizing schemes. In other words, kind of converging everything into the control of the central government. And there have been a lot of objections to this idea because, as I said, different states have had different track records in terms of protection of migrant workers. Some are very good and some are not. And some have their own schemes. So for example, Kerala has been very progressive in this field and very has very effective policy framework. So if you try to homogenize and centralize all the different types of workers and all the different places where they come from and where they go, you're really papering over the significant state and regional differences in terms of workforces, in terms of labor and welfare regimes, and so on and so forth. So, e-Shram. So what the central government came out, again, after that mission mode thing, it came out with this e-Shram scheme. It's basically a portal where, again, the worker is responsible for self-registration. And the idea is that it's meant only for unorganized sector workers. So any unorganized sector worker between the age of 16 and 59 can go online, register in this portal, and get an e-Shram card. And the idea behind this is, A, to create that database that we talked about, so a way of tracking workers and so that you can better deliver welfare to them. The idea is that once you've got people registered in this system, you can then begin linking it to various other welfare schemes. So on paper, it looks all very good. And as of June in this year, the dashboard showed about 290 million registrations, which is a lot. So after registration on the portal, workers receive an e-Shram card with a unique 12-digit number. So now they have two cards, Aadhaar and unique e-Shram, which is supposed to allow them to, as I said, to take advantage of various welfare schemes anywhere in India. So this is supposed to address the problem of portability also. e-Shram registration also promised workers insurance for death or permanent disability up to 2 lakh rupees, accident, partial disability insurance up to 1 lakh, pension of 3,000 a month, etc. And as I said, the idea is to integrate social security schemes of both central and state governments into this database, and so that it would make the dispersal, identification of beneficiary and dispersal of benefits easier. At the moment, e-Shram is integrated with 2 central level health insurance and pension schemes, but we do not have any information about any other schemes that have been linked or how is it working. So e-Shram has succeeded in creating this kind of unique data set, but what we have found both from our own research and talking to NGOs and other people who work in this domain is several issues, both at the level of conceptualization and design of the database, but also in terms of implementation. So first of all, it relies on the self-enrollment and self-certification of the worker. This assumes a level of digital literacy and access to technology that hardly exists or does not exist, you can say, across all unorganized sector workers. So as I said, they require a Aadhaar card and then a bank account linked to a stable mobile number. All these issues are a real problem for mobile workers. And so what that means is that most workers require assistance in registering, and that has led to the emergence of a class of intermediaries. It could be your local mobile shop in the village, it could be the Kendra Seva, which is a government thing, or it could be an NGO who is helping workers get registered, but basically you're going through these third-party intermediaries to get it done. Second problem, migrant workers are required to provide their current address when registering in e-Shram, which reflects the state where they are employed. This then has to be verified by both the home state and the receiving state. And this information is supposed to be updated periodically in order for the workers to receive benefits. But as I just talked about, these workers are highly mobile. They might be in Jharkhand today, Bengaluru tomorrow, and Delhi the next day. So how are they supposed to, first of all, update this system and follow up with what they're supposed to do is a major question mark here. A very fundamental issue here is that it places the onus of registration on workers. There is no responsibility assigned either to the employer or to the labor contractors. So in other words, the whole system that I just described to you, where you have big construction companies and real estate up at the top, and you have workers at the bottom, and you have all these people in between, right, who are mobilizing them and putting them to work. At the end, the government only looks at the worker as an individual. The government is not looking at the system through which that person becomes a worker and the conditions under which that work is happening. So this individualization with, the state here and the individual worker over here, and creating that linkage is again something we see in a lot of the welfare schemes after digitalization in India. But there are certain issues here in terms of basically blacking out the role of the employer. What is the responsibility of the employer, for these workers? So, as I said, a lot of this work is outsourced to third-party agencies and NGOs, and the principal employer is not required to ensure that workers are registered. Then another interesting issue emerged, which is that if a worker has enrolled in EPFO, which is the Provident Fund scheme, which you get enrolled in, your employer can enroll you in if you were working for, I think, more than 6 months or 1 year, I'm not sure, then you are by definition an organized sector worker. So now you cannot register in e-Shram. So what it's done, there's a field there which says, do you have an EPFO number or not? So if the answer is yes, you are by definition not an organized sector. But the problem here is that, again, because this workforce is so mobile and fluid, I could be, say, a mason who was employed on a site in Bombay for 2 years in a fairly stable job, and my employer has enrolled me in Provident Fund scheme. I have a number, Provident EPFO number. Now that job is over, and I'm working as a casual worker in Bangalore. So unorganized sector. But now I cannot avail of this because I've already been, excluded by this, by enrolling in PF. So again, to me, this is just another example where government policies, schemes, and these portals are being designed by people who don't understand the realities on the ground. And if you don't understand how labor is actually being deployed, actually being hired, actually being managed, then you will end up with these kinds of gaps. Number 5, the problem of portability of benefits has still not been resolved, even though that's what e-Shram was supposed to do. e-Shram is expected to resolve this problem through efficient data sharing mechanisms between central government and states, but guidelines on data sharing between e-Shram and other stakeholders are vague and confusing, and it really hasn't happened. And we found when we went to Jharkhand to see what was happening there that, at least in Jharkhand, the state government, instead of trying to create a mechanism to directly enroll workers in e-Shram, they were using other existing databases and dumping it into e-Shram. So, for example, they have databases such as MGNREGA, the Rural Employment Scheme, or SHG data, or Upadhya Kendra data, etc. Now, we need to still look into this more, but even any basic IT person will tell you that this raises all kinds of issues about data compatibility, interoperability of systems, duplication, etc. It's not clear how they plan to clean it up if they're dumping data, from different databases into this one thing. The reason why this was happening is because the central government gave all the states these really high targets for e-Shram registration. You have to do so many lakhs within this time period, which nobody could get done. And so they were resorting to all these other methods. Okay, so as I said, with all of this digitalization of various welfare schemes, we have had increasing dependence on third-party agencies, especially NGOs, but also other kinds of brokers, et cetera, to actually implement, to make sure that workers are getting registered and can avail of the benefits of these schemes. So we interviewed NGOs, both in Bangalore and Jharkhand, NGO workers who were involved in this kind of work. And they told us many stories about the difficulties they were facing in terms of entering data, getting the verification done. So for example, when you need to get the OTP from the Aadhaar system, and just endless stream of difficulties that they were facing. They would have to sit on average with one worker for 45 minutes to get the work done. And when you have a target of thousands, it's a bit of a problem. So the overall point of our analysis here is that it seems that the question of social welfare for migrant workers that the government started with, trying to fix this problem, ended up being reduced to a question of registration and datafication of workers. That somehow if you can convert these workers into data points, then somehow you've already gone half the way, but we've seen that's not the case. So for example, these are just a couple of quotes from our interviews. One is from an NGO worker who talks about the difficulty of doing the e-Shram registration. So even though they've reduced some of the formalities of registration, it remains difficult. Here now she's talking about BOCW benefits and the difficulty of, even if you get the worker registered, availing the benefits is very difficult. And even managers and construction companies that we spoke to have the same complaints. Now, of course, the whole system that I described really makes it easier for companies to evade any kind of compliance with labor laws. But they do try to achieve some level of compliance. For example, enrolling some workers in Provident Fund scheme, or seeing that at least the more long-term workers are enrolled in BOCW. But they also complained about this multiplication of different requirements that keep coming up. Every time there's a new scheme, there's a new requirement to register, to get the paperwork done, etc. So this is an HR manager speaking, saying that how are we supposed to get this done? Yes, NGOs will come and help us, but the contractors complain because when the worker is sitting with the NGO person getting this registration done, he's not on the job. And then, I've got thousands of workers, I've got 1,000 workers on site. How would I ever get all this done? And then he went on and on about the fact that every state has a different policy, which makes it all the more complicated. Which is not to let construction companies off the hook, but I'm just saying that they are also very much aware of this issue. So we tried to look a little closely into this outsourcing of policy implementation in the case of Jharkhand, where it was one of the source regions that we looked at. And here we looked at an initiative that was started in early 2022 called the Safe and Responsible Migration Initiative, SRMI. And this was basically a scheme that was put together by a for-profit consultancy firm, a couple of NGOs, state government, labor department, and it was funded by the Upadhya network, okay? So we found it quite surprising when we went, means my research associate went to interview people in the labor department. The only people we found there were those, employees of the SRMI, that is the NGO people and so on. I mean, the actual government officers were just not there. So basically, and I think this is probably true for a lot of domains, not just labor, but where there's been a kind of outsourcing of the entire government to these kind of agencies with external funding to run the schemes that the government wants to implement. So in the case of Jharkhand, what happened, they already had a long-standing or an older scheme which was called the Shamadan scheme of their own, where they were trying to register migrant workers going out of state. So when the migrant labor crisis happened, they tried to increase registrations through this SRMI. So with Shamadan, the workers get what's called a Shramik card or a Shramik registration number. So that is supposed to entitle them again to some protections and benefits, etc. So after COVID, the scheme comes in and they were trying to really increase the registrations under the Shamadan scheme in order to track workers. But then the government came out with the, what's the other one I talked about? Sorry. The e-Shram. See, I get confused among there's so many schemes. Government came out with eShram, and central government told Jharkhand government, now you have to register everyone in eShram. So suddenly all the NGOs were being told, now you shift your focus and forget Shamadan, now you go and do eShram work. So when we went and actually spoke to these NGO workers on the ground, they were also in a total state of confusion, as to what they're supposed to be doing. And they also found many issues in terms of just getting the registrations done, and all the other jobs that they were supposed to do to support migrant workers. And it was as basic as, for example, when we asked them about, the procedure for actually entering the data to register a worker, in either case, eShram or the Shamadan, they didn't know, there's a field that says employer's phone number, but they don't know that. They don't know who's the employer. Is it the contractor? Or is it the principal employer who's the company, right? Even that basic thing is not clarified by the system. So they have no idea, so they'll just enter some phone number and hope that, that will work. And they certainly wouldn't have the phone number of the companies, right? So for example, when our research associate visited a district office in 2022, he found a staff of only 3, the district coordinator, a field assistant, and a data entry operator. And they have been given a target of registering 1 lakh migrant workers in the previous 6 months, of which they had managed to fill up only 2,000 forms. So you can see that there's a lot of overburdening of workers and maybe overextension in terms of the imagination of what needs to be done to take care of the migrant worker issue. Okay. So I'm going to just wind up after this one or two slides, tracking the labor card. So all of this proliferation of schemes means that there's been a proliferation or multiplication of different cards. And workers, when you talk to them, we ask them, do you have a labor card? But they don't know what we mean, and we don't know what we mean, because sometimes they will just pull out the gate pass that the company has given them. During the time they are employed, they have a gate pass to get into the site. Or they might show their Aadhaar card. We did find interestingly, almost all the workers we interviewed do have Aadhaar, and they know what it is. But they might pull out their NREGA job card from back home in their village. Or sometimes they would show the Shramik card, like in the case of Jharkhand, or voter ID, or eShram, or ration card. I mean, basically, they have all these cards floating around, but if you then try to probe and say, well, what do you think is the benefit of registering in BOCW? What is the benefit of registering in eShram? They are clueless. No one ever tells them that, if you get the eShram card, this is what you can do with it, etc. So there's a lot of confusion, a lot of cynicism, suspicion. They have no idea what is the point of all these schemes that they're asked to enroll in. And their basic thing is, hey, I just want to work, I just want to get my money, I want to go back home. So don't bother me, because they have very little faith that any of these welfare schemes are going to actually give them anything. In the end, they just want to earn as much money as they can while they're in Bangalore. So overall, I would say the cross-cutting of these different types of identification systems seems to have hindered rather than streamlined provision of social rights or welfare benefits to migrant workers. There's a whole series of issues that I already spoke about here. Final slide. It seems that the policy thrust has been on registering workers rather than linking them to schemes. Maybe that will happen in future. I'm not that negative. But till now, we don't see much of improvement in terms of accessing benefits. Again, to repeat, the main issue to me is that the onus of registration and accessing benefits is placed on the workers and not on the contractors and not on the employers. And the responsibility of providing benefits is placed on the government rather than the employers. In other words, employers have absolutely no responsibility in terms of ensuring that certain basic standards, labor standards, are met as far as migrant or construction workers goes. And this data-driven approach, according to me, is creating as many problems as it may be also solving. There's this notion that if you centralize and standardize data collection, you will somehow make governance more, easier, more transparent. but it is completely overlooking the existing contradictions of labor governance framework that I talked about in the beginning, that how does this labor sourcing system actually work? So even though digitalization may make basic welfare benefits even more inaccessible, it may make it more inaccessible, reinforcing, this is our conclusion, reinforcing the precarities and disadvantages of unorganized migrant workers rather than actually providing protections. Okay, so I want to make some acknowledgements. The co-researcher on this project, Ardra Surendran, 3 research associates who worked with us in the field, Rohit, Vikas, and Sachin, not this Sachin, another Sachin, and many, many people who, of course, cooperated with us in giving interviews. 2 funding agencies, which is APU and ICSSR, and our home institutions. Thanks.